Hello, and welcome back. In our last part, we looked at the psychoanalytical literary criticism and the different terminologies related to Freudian theory. In today's class, we will start off by looking at some of the concepts and ideas related to the theoretician Carl Gustav Jung, who was Freud's disciple and protege before they parted ways. Now, Carl Gustav Jung is instrumental in that he differed from Sigmund Freud very significantly towards the later part of his career. He was instrumental in developing something that we know today as archetypal criticism. Now, archetypal criticism is a school of literary criticism that concerns itself with the idea of archetypes. Now, archetypes themselves are things that denote narratives and narrative designs, patterns of action, character types and themes, as well as images, which are identifiable in a wide variety of works of literature. Now, by wide variety of works of literature, I mean across time and space. For example, archetypal characters might be found in a novel that was published in the 16th century, as well as something that was published in the 20th century. Now, archetypal themes and patterns might also be found in something that was published in India or in Algeria, as well as something that was published in Australia. So archetypes also figure very prominently in myths, dreams, and even social rituals and customs. Now, such recurrent images and patterns are thought to be a result of an elemental and universal forms and patterns in the human psyche. And an embodiment of these patterns and images in literary works are thought to evoke a very strong emotional response in the reader of such a cultural artifact, such as a text. Now, for instance, we have archetypes for characters. A classic example might be a classic character trope would be that of a hero archetype. A hero archetype is perhaps embodied by a person who is traditionally and across culturally diverse settings seen as someone who is brave, who is strong, who is heroic and noble, and such characters can be found across cultures. For example, we have the character of Hercules, and who is complemented by someone like Bhima or Arjuna in the Indian mythology. To give you another example, we have the character of Karna, who can be strongly compared to the character of Achilles for Greek mythology. Likewise, the death rebirth theme is also said to be the mother of all archetypes, the archetype of all archetypes, and this is said to be grounded in the cycle of the seasons and the organic cycle of human life, and this type of archetype occurs in primitive rituals also. For example, in the rituals of the king or the myth of the king, who is ritually sacrificed to be reborn over and over again, and in stories and myths of gods who die and are reborn and over again. Now, such themes can be seen in a diverse and multitude and diverse texts, such as texts ranging from the Bible to Dante's Divine Comedy that was published in the early 14th century, and even in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which was published in 1879. So you can see how these diverse texts still rely on the same recurrent pattern or motive. Now, although we understand Carl Gustav Jung to be a disciple of Freud, his version of that psychology is rather very different from the theories of Freud himself, or that Freud himself advocated. Now, that is how a union criticism or union archetypal criticism differs radically from psychoanalytical criticism. Now, the key difference here that we need to understand is that Jung's emphasis is not on the individual unconscious. No, it is not on the personal or indeed individual unconscious like Freud. Instead, his emphasis is on what he called the collective unconscious, which is something that he understood to be shared by all individuals across cultures, which he regards as the repository of racial memories and primordial images and patterns of experience that he also called archetypes. So while Freud viewed literature as a disguised form of a sort of a well-wish fulfillment, Jung regards literature as an expression of the archetypes from the collective unconscious. Therefore, according to Jung, a great author would provide for his readers access to archetypal images that are buried deep within his or her racial memory, thus granting access to images that are integral and relevant both to the individual as well as the human race at the same time. To give you an example, an archetypal person who practices archetypal criticism would perhaps argue that the reason why human beings have a tendency to settle alongside water bodies is that being in water gives one the idea of it evokes a very strong primordial racial memory of being suspended in water while he was a fetus in his mother's womb. So this affinity towards being suspended in water is perhaps what draws people to settle down and make civilization perhaps close to water bodies. This would be perhaps in argument that our union critics would make. And you can see thus Hume's theory of literature has been an important definitive formative influence on archetypal criticism and what we call myth criticism. So now that we have concluded our brief introduction to Freudian and Jungian psychoanalytical criticism, we shall now attempt to sum up what a Freudian psychoanalytical critic would perhaps seek to accomplish. Now, a Freudian psychoanalytical critic would, as you recall, give central importance in literary interpretation to the distinction between the conscious and the unconscious elements of one's mind. They would, for example, associate the literary work's overt content and structure, which is to say, its story and plot devices, etc., with that of the unconscious mind, and the covert content, which is the hidden content with the unconscious elements of his psyche. And in this process, privileging, of course, the unconscious over the conscious. A psychoanalytical critic would also pay close attention to the unconscious motives and feelings, whether these belong to that of the character, the characters within a particular text, or that of the author himself. They also make large-scale applications of psychoanalytical concepts to literary history in general. For example, you might recall how we talked in the first lecture about Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence, and in which we have talked about how Bloom sees the struggle for identity by each generation of poets under the threat of the looming greatness of his predecessors. And this is seen by Harold Bloom as an enactment of the Oedipus complex itself. Now, a psychoanalytical critic would also privilege the individual psychology at the expense of a social or a historical context. Freud, as I mentioned before, Freud was interested in the personal unconscious rather than the collective unconscious, and he would also privilege the personal unconscious over the conflict between perhaps social masses and social classes, as a Marxist critic would perhaps do. Now, to give you a practical flavor, if you want, of how a psychoanalytic might approach a literary text, we have the case of Shakespeare Hamlet. Now, Shakespeare's Hamlet was famously psychoanalyzed by Freud himself. And for those of you who are not familiar with the plot of Hamlet, let me quickly remind you. In Shakespeare's play, Hamlet is a prince whose father has been murdered by his own brother, that is, by Hamlet's uncle, which is to say that this is a murder story and a revenge story. And not only has the king been murdered by his brother, the king's wife is also now in the possession of this new king, which is to say that Hamlet's mother has been married to Hamlet's uncle now. Now, in the play, the ghost of Hamlet's father appears to Hamlet in an apparition, and he wants his son to avenge his death. The ghost wants Hamlet to kill Hamlet's uncle to, of course, avenge the king's death. Now, we understand that there is an obvious difficulty for Hamlet in achieving this, and thus the famous, of course, to be or not to be. But throughout the play, we see that Hamlet is forever making excuses to not actually now avenge his father's death. Now, we wonder why, of course. Why is Hamlet reluctant to now dispose of his uncle and seek justice and avenge his father's death? We now know that Hamlet is not particularly squeamish. He is not that he's a worst idea of a murder. He doesn't have the worst idea of the murder. We see that Hamlet is capable of killing. Is capable of killing a lot of other characters within the play span. So why does he keep on making excuses? And moreover, what we need to understand is that what the ghost tells Hamlet only confirms the suspicions that Hamlet has already had regarding the murder of his father. And yet he forever keeps on delaying his plans of revenge. So why is this? So this is where psychoanalytical or psychoanalytic criticism offers us a very neat and simple solution. Now, Freud tells us that Hamlet cannot avenge this crime because he is guilty of wanting to commit the crime himself. At this point, I would like to draw your attention to the idea of the Oedipus complex again that we discussed in the first lecture. Freud claims that Hamlet has an Oedipus complex, that is, he has a repressed and unconscious sexual desire for his own mother and a consequent wish to do away with his father. Thus, what Hamlet's uncle has done is to merely do what Hamlet has always wanted to do. He has eliminated his father and possessed his mother, and this is precisely how Hamlet faces the difficulty of avenging his father's death. Now, this view of the play was first sketched out by Freud in his work, famous work, The Interpretation of Dreams, which was published in 1900. Now, interestingly, Freud does not stop here. he links the situation of Hamlet to that of Shakespeare himself, citing the view that this play was written immediately after the death of Shakespeare's own father in 1601. And this is the point of time where Shakespeare's own childhood feelings about his father might have been freshly revived. And Freud's adds, quote, "It is known that," and I quote here, "that Shakespeare's own son, who died at an early age, bore the name of Hamlet, which is identical to that of Hamlet," end of quote. So, the sketch for an interpretation of the play that was thus put forward by Freud was later developed by his British colleague Ernest Jones in his work called Hamlet and Oedipus, which was published in 1949. And with that, we, of course, conclude this brief discussion of Sigmund Freud's and Carl Gustav Jung. And we come to the next big name when it comes to psychoanalytical literary criticism, that is Jacques Lacan. Now, Jacques Lacan lived between 1901 and 1981. He also has a considerable amount of influence on psychoanalytic theory and criticism, of course, and this is why we are discussing it. Now, Lacan was a French psychoanalyst whose work had a really tremendous and extraordinary impact upon many aspects of recent literary theory in general. Now, like Freud, Lacan began his career by taking a medical degree and then training in psychiatry during the 1920s. Subsequently, his ideas were also vastly influenced by other prominent literary figures, such as the anthropologist Lévi-Strauss, the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, and even the linguist and literary critic Roman Jakobson. Now, Lacan maintains that language is central to psychoanalysis because in investigating the unconscious, the psychoanalyst always resorts to the use of examining and using language. In effect, Freudian psychology is almost entirely a verbal science. Now, according to Lacan, the unconscious is not the chaotic mass of disparate material as might have been formerly been assumed. For Lacan, the unconscious is very much structure. It is structure like a language. So what he maintains is that the psychoanalytic experience discovers in the unconscious basically the whole structure of language itself. So Lacan is basically attending a marriage between linguistics and psychoanalysis, and that is perhaps his most important contribution, of course. The unconscious in Lacan's most famous slogan is structured like a language. But how is this structure achieved? Lacan maintains that modern language studies begin with the arrival of Saussure, who shows that meaning in the language is basically a matter of contrast and difference between words. So what we have is basically meaning that is generated through a difference and contrast between words and not between words and things. Meaning thus becomes basically a network of differences. Throughout the study of linguistics, we know that signs are composed of signifiers and signifieds. And signifier is basically a phonetic symbol and a phonetic utterance, a four-letter word that would perhaps imply the existence of a tree. The signified, on the other hand, is the content, is the concept of the idea of the tree itself. So that is how we say that a sign is composed of a phonetic aspect as well as the conceptual idea or the idea itself. Now, linguistics tells us that signifiers can only relate to one another. So, for example, if I were to tell you what a town is, I would probably have to explain what a town is in relation to what a village is. For example, I could always make the argument that a town is a very large village. But as you can see, that does not really tell us a lot. We are just substituting the town with that of a village, and this is precisely where Lacan comes in. He claims that the actual signified is a meaning that is perpetually deferred. Meaning is not accessible to us. It forever slips from us. It always eludes us. There is a perpetual barrier between what is signified and the signifier itself. There is a barrier between the word and the concept. Hence, we are forced to accept the incessant slipping of the signified and the signifier, as you can see from the example that we have given before. Now, following this is the basis on from which he develops his perhaps more significant contribution. Now, following this, Lacan argues that the dream work, the two dream work mechanisms identified by Freud, which we discussed in our earlier, of course, lecture, which is condensation and displacement. These correspond to the basic poles of language itself that are identified by the linguist Roman Jakobson, which is to say, this corresponds to metaphor and metonymy, that is condensation and displacement, correspond to metaphor and metonymy respectively. The correspondence here is that in metonymy, one thing represents another by means of the part standing for a whole, which is to say that perhaps if you are seeking a cola, you might ask for a Pepsi instead of asking for, a cola in general. Thus, in Freudian dream interpretation, an element in the dream might stand for something else by displacement. For example, going back to our previous example, a lover who is, in this case, Italian might be represented in the dream by an extension of something, an attribute of his. For example, an Italian lover might be represented in the dream as an Italian car. For example, a Ferrari or an Alfa Romeo. So Lacan says, or Lacan maintains, that this is the same as metonymy, the part standing for the whole. Similarly, in condensation, several things might be condensed and compressed into one symbol, just like, of course, a metaphor. For example, consider the expression, he is a snake in the grass. This is a common expression, right? This is a common metaphor that refers to someone who is perhaps not visibly bad or dangerous, but has eventually turned a traitor. He is therefore like a snake in grass, someone who is not easily visible, but someone who is capable of biting without warning. Therefore, adapting the Lacanian outlook would involve value in the modernist or the postmodernist experimental fragmented elusive text. and therefore, in instance, a novel might play with the devices of the novel itself, or might value to other novels and so on. So Lacan's foregrounding of the unconscious also leads him to speculate about the mechanism by which we emerge into consciousness itself. Now, Lacan says that before a sense of self can be established, a young child exists in the realm of what Lacan calls the imaginary. Now, the realm of the imaginary, or in the realm of the imaginary, there is no distinction between the self and the other, and there is a kind of idolized identification with the mother. Then between 6 months and 18 months, the child goes through what Lacan calls a mirror stage. This is a stage wherein the child sees his own reflection in the mirror and begins to conceive of itself. It starts understanding that it is a unique individual of its own, which has its own identity that is separate from the rest of the world. Now, this mirror need not be an actual physical mirror. It can be the portal through which the child interacts with the external world. For example, every time a parent comes and talks to a child or touches it, it realizes that. And it realizes that it has an identity of its own, and that that it is a separate entity that is capable of interacting with the world around it. And it is at this point that Lacan claims that the child enters the language system, which is basically and essentially a system that is concerned with ideas of lack and separation, something that separates itself from the imaginary. Now, ideas of lack and separation are also crucial Lacanian concepts, since, as Lacan pointed out, language names what is not present or substitutes a linguistic sign for what cannot be tangibly perceived. This stage also significantly marks the beginning of a child's socialization, with its prohibition and with its restrictions, with laws and order. And similarly, as you can imagine, this is associated with the figure of the father, of course. So, while then the imaginary is associated with the mother, the symbolic, the initiation into language is associated with that of the father figure. And with that, we conclude our second lecture. We will conclude this whole lecture series with an exploration of how practically Lacanian criticism can be used in the next lecture, inshallah, in which we are going to have a practical example of how to put psychoanalytic criticism into practice with the literary text. Thank you so much, and see you in the next lecture, inshallah. Thank you very much.